Hello, John.
Hey, Aaron. Good to see you.
You as well. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm a little bit sad today, and I
Oh,
just wanted to start this webinar off with a little bit of a memory.
uh,
I had a paramedic partner from many years ago who also became a very close friend pass away on Monday.
I'm so
And
sorry.
yeah, his name was Reed Knutson, and 45 years ago next month, I met him at Ridgeview Medical Center, a little hospital ambulance service that I worked with in Minnesota.
Mm,
And of course, it's not a little service anymore,
right.
but Reed started there and worked some 30 years there. And the thing I wanted to just mention about Reed, and I wanted to mention this because I think many of our listeners we often think our era is the era, right?
Mm,
And I just wanted to say that one of the things that all of us as those of us that knew Reed have been changing and exchanging memories of him. One of the things that we all liked about him was that if you were on a difficult call, meaning where the patient was difficult or the family was difficult, Reed had this amazing and wonderful way of connecting with people.
mm,
He was clearly a person who came to this work because he wanted to do the field work, never became a supervisor, never became an educator, was always just a field paramedic, and was an amazing example of our best employees.
mm,
And what was really interesting, and I think will connect to our topic today, is that Reed did not ask for much.
mm.
He simply wanted to be recognized for his passion to take good care of people. And he wanted the bosses in front of him to clear the path so
Mm.
that he could do that.
Would you mind? Can I ask you a question about Reed?
Sure.
Would you tell us a memory that comes to you about Reed that would make you smile?
Well, and this is an easy one. We were on a call, and Reed was often we would talk about things that were important, and it wasn't a particularly critical call, but we were going lights and siren. But because we were deeply engaged in a philosophical discussion, I recognized he was driving, and I looked out the rear view mirror and noticed that the cars were piling up behind us because we weren't driving fast enough. So it's one of
Oh,
the things that makes me smile, and it was very typical of Reed.
nice. Well, thank you for sharing that with me and for sharing that with all that are listening. And I also want to connect why I asked that question here in a little bit. So if you would grant me a little grace in holding that for a moment, I'll tie those together. But I had a couple other questions for you. Have you been thinking about next year? What 2023 may be like for you?
Yeah, I have.
Okay. And as you've been thinking about it, especially as you've been thinking about it in the context of many of the clients that we work with, what's your forecast as you think about 2023, knowing we've gone through 2 to 3 years of a worldwide pandemic, shortages, some of the things we've taken for granted in our lives being put on hold for a while. Do you see next year getting better, being about the same, or getting harder? What's your crystal ball tell you about next year?
Well, you know me, Aaron,
Mm,
well, and you know that generally speaking, I'm an optimist, and
yeah.
generally speaking, I'm very positive about people, and I am positive about the moral arc. But I have to tell you, I am concerned about the road ahead.
Yeah.
I however this election that's coming up in November turns out, I think we are not going to find a smoother path forward. I also think that from a workforce standpoint and just from an economic standpoint and from sort of us having to deal with a variety of issues in our communities, I think it's going to be difficult. And I don't see us magically finding a smooth runway very soon.
Yeah, thank you. And you kind of hit on some of those keys that I also was thinking about and curious about. And as I, like you, have thought both personally and professionally, I'm worried that our ability to find and keep great people will be as difficult, if not more. There does not appear to be any light at the end of the tunnel when it comes to the financial resources available to ambulance services. And I think the skills and talents of leadership will be even more in demand, more necessary this next year. And dare I say, more demand in more demand than maybe the clinical and operational prowess that we have prided ourselves on for so long. I think if I had certain tools that I will need next year, I think I'll be able to leave a few of them in the toolbox, but that leadership and management one, I'm probably going to have to take out of the box a lot. And so,
well, and I just wanted to
please
tee off of that, because you in mentioning leadership, one of the things we often teach is that the need for real leadership, not just authority figures, but the need for genuine influencers who can connect with people and inspire them, really emerges. The need for that really emerges when things are difficult or when things need to change. And I mean, this is why I think not just authority figures, but genuine, real leaders are what we need now.
And that so illustrates one of the things I've been thinking a lot about, and it's a concept that's getting some conversation nationally, and it's a concept called quiet quitting. I wonder if you've heard about it.
I have.
And let me share what I think I know about it as I've read about it from a number of different sources, both academic, some of the journals, as well as some of the periodicals such as Harvard Business Review, Forbes magazine, Fortune, etc. And it seems like it has two major components. One component of this thought of quiet quitting is when employees have begun to bring more balance to themselves and to their lives. So let's think of it this way. It's not probably too hard for all of us listening and those that might be watching the video to know that the amount of time we put into work every day has gone up over the years. There may have been a time where it was the classic work your shift or work your 9 to 5, and then your weekends were free. Maybe occasionally you checked an email. And now, of course, that has grown from, as soon as we wake in the morning, we're clearing out our inbox, we're working throughout the day. The computer, the phone might sit next to us throughout the evening, including the weekends, including vacations. So some of quiet quitting, as I understand it, one component is where employees have begun to say, I should find more balance. And so might I be better at leaving things off until the clock starts? Maybe when I take a vacation, I will commit to myself, the person that I might love and live with, to leave that phone at home. Something along those lines. So that was one of the components that I've heard about. I also want to talk about the others, but I was wondering if you had heard or had some additional thoughts on that first part of bringing that balance in the context of quiet quitting.
Yeah, I think a shorthand of that first one you're talking about is employees really saying, I'm going to leave work within the boundaries of work. And so I'll do what I need to do, It doesn't mean that they're not going to do the job. It means but they will only do what they need to do. And
Yeah.
it's putting a fence, I guess if we could say that, around work.
And I, like you, have a vintage on my practice here at Emergency Medical Services. And it's a little dated these days. And I want to talk about that first part because I think we as leaders, I as a leader, may have been brought up in an environment that would shun this first part of quiet quitting. So if I have an employee who says, hey, boss, let's say you schedule us 36 hours, that's full time. And you work your 36 hours, but hey, John, you don't pick up a single extra shift. That means my interpretation, because of my vintage, that you're not a dedicated employee. You're not loyal. You're not enthusiastic. You're not committed. And you're certainly not willing to do more than expected. I worry that we will bring our own history. My history is starting in EMS, that you needed to work every shift you possibly could. And you needed to be as burned out, as grumpy, as cranky as the other burned out paramedics as a badge of honor. That's when you had met the test. And so I worry a little bit about us as leaders that might be a little senior, that we might have a negative reaction when our employees begin to find that better balance that says, while I'm here at work, within the time you expect of me, I will be fully engaged. I will give my all. But when I'm done, I'm done. I might not check my emails. I might not answer my phone. I might not see those text messages. I come back to work, I'll be all back in again.
Yeah, there's so much to unpack there, right? But let me just suffice to say it that many of us in the vintage that you're talking about are not at all examples of balance.
Yeah.
And are not at all the right people to be teaching balance.
Yeah. So as we think about this first part of quiet quitting, where our employees, because of the recent life experiences, having maybe gone through COVID, maybe having gone through the struggles that came with it, have begun to say, life can be richer when I can bring the richness from my work, but the richness from outside of my work. I hope we as leaders, I know I am working through this myself, of how I do judge people. Am I judging people based on how many shifts they picked up? Am I judging them on how rich the experience was while they were here at work? But as we think about a concept you know from John and I, and we will continue to be disciples of, is this concept of engagement. And I kind of used its definition there briefly, which is this feeling, right? It's a feeling. It's not analytical. I can't measure it. I can measure it in an indirect way, but there's not a chart, a graph, a spreadsheet for it. It's this feeling about how enthused, committed, loyal, enthusiastic, willing to do more than expected I am. And we as leaders could possibly harm that richness when we begin to measure our employees on simply how burned out they are. And if they're not burnt out enough, if they're not picking up all the extra shifts, if they're not, checking their email off duty, if they're not working from sun up to sundown. This first part of quiet quitting is about this realization that life will be fuller, life will be richer when I balance both. And the research I'm reading, the work from Gallup and others, say that if I, as a leader, will be part of that, not only will the productiveness that I get from employees when they're at work be higher, but their overall success will be better when I can be part of that.
So just for our readers that are interested, the latest sort of gathering of this is a Gallup book, John Clifton's book called Blind Spots. And the blind spot he's talking about is the fact that we have not paid attention to the subject of well-being or the happiness of our employees. So let me just remind you, since Aarron brought up the whole engagement thing. And Aarron, I just wanted to mention this, is that, so 2020 statistics, Gallup is the largest worldwide surveyor of employee engagement. And remember, engagement is about the relationship that the employee has with the organization and whether or not that relationship is warm and positive. And so the 2020 numbers say that 36% of employees are engaged. That 50% of employees, and this is just in the United States, 36% are engaged, 50% are indifferent, and 14% are actively disengaged or actively being oppositional in the organization. Now, the reason I want you to think of that is it's really interesting because in 2020, it's fully 50-50 balanced, right? So we have 36 that are engaged and 14% which are actively disengaged, which adds up to 50, but the 50% in the middle, so half of your employees are indifferent. And why that's important is that the 50% in the middle, and I'm guessing for listeners that this might not be that different in your organization. I bet if we came and looked, we would find about half the people in your organization aren't totally enthused and aren't really oppositional and creating problems. So why that's important, before Aarron goes on and talks about the second point here about quiet quitting, is that these 50% in the middle are tippy. We can tip them either way. And they will likely tip either way based on what you as a supervisor, manager, executive do. And that's where it's so important that you recognize in this issue of quiet quitting that there are a number of your people, probably half or more of your people, looking to you for the clue.
And you heard us talk before about both the academic and research-based support, that getting really clear about your culture in such a way that people want to be highly engaged. Those numbers that John just talked about, the actively engaged go up, the indifferent go down, and the actively disengaged, to the best of our ability, go away as much as possible, is the competitive edge to finding and keeping more of the right people. So the second part of quiet quitting that I've been learning about, John, is a more troubling part. And as the name kind of alludes to, it's where people have quit, but they're still on the payroll. So the quiet part, they haven't told anybody they've quit. They haven't tendered a resignation, they haven't fired off an email. But if we really studied their actions and behaviors every day, they've quit. They're doing just enough. And they tell Clifton through the book and through the research that came out in a couple recent articles in Harvard Business Review and Fortune, that they'll do just enough to not be noticed. But their intentions are clear. I am done with this place. I am done with where it's going. I'm done with what I need to do here, but I want to continue to draw a paycheck. So we've at times over the years used words like working while retired and a number of different little catchphrases that come out. But the interesting part of Gallup's work is that the number they estimated was at least 50%, and they thought that they drastically probably underestimated the number. That there are folks, so think of your organization. think of your ambulance service, the calls that you go on, your clinic, your hospital, all of the different kind of organizations where folks are doing the bare minimum. Bare minimum's not even the right word. And so, for example, a recent story on National Public Radio on quiet quitting had one of the speakers talking about one of the most popular devices that employees are purchasing right now is a device that moves your mouse and clicks it, so that any systems an organization may use to track your productivity is basically faked. The extent somebody would go to purchase something to basically make their computer show that they're working, that's kind of what we're talking about, quiet quitting. What have you been learning about quiet quitting, John?
Well, the same thing, and I'm really interested in quiet quitting in the context of first responders in an EMS community. So let's just talk about that for a little bit. I certainly won't be able to hide behind a screen and just get a bot to move my mouse.
Right.
I have to show up. I have to be in uniform. I have to get on a truck. I have to go on calls. But the quiet quitting is that I dull myself and I shut myself off to really the messages of the organization. I have determined that I'm not going to contribute more than absolutely is necessary.
Yeah.
And so I may still be a good clinician. I may still fill out my charts, but I'm not at all interested in moving the organization forward.
And here's an example that comes to my mind, and one of our clients shared this with me, and it also mirrors the engagement canoe in many aspects. So the employee we're hoping for, John and Aarron, are an ambulance crew, and what they hope of John and Aarron, and I know, John, that's a scary thought. The hair just went on the back of my neck up as well. But so John and Aarron go on an ambulance call. We forget one of the pumps at the hospital. If John and Aarron are actively engaged, not only do we write it up, we fill out some kind of form that says, hey, there's a pump missing. But before we even fill out the form, we called back to the hospital, checked to see if we could find it. They found it up on 5th floor over in the 3rd wing. We talked to the nurse, kind of sweet talked her a little bit, got her to bring it, put it in the ER, put a little note on it. And one of us is going to go grab it after we get off shift tomorrow. And we'll let dispatch know that if there's a crew in the area, we'll go meet up with them so we get the pump back. But we just wrote it up because we just wanted to make sure people knew. It's done. So if we're in the middle, if we're indifferent, I'd say, hey, John, did you get the pump? No. Did you get the pump? No. Well, we'll write it up when we get back. Here's where I think quiet quitting shows up. So John's driving as we pull away from the hospital. I'm sitting over in the passenger seat. I should be writing my chart, but I'm going to do that when we get back so that I can keep us out of the service a little bit longer. And I say, John, did you grab the pump? John says, no. I said, I didn't grab the pump. We're maybe a block away from the hospital. Without missing a beat, at the same time, we both go, F them. And we drive back. To me, when I heard that story, I heard not only actively disengaged, but I heard quiet quitting.
Yeah.
And what I'm really worried about with quiet quitting is how contagious it could be. In this world that we live in, where we seem to preference the negative, we have all these echo chambers going on. We're really going after our cognitive biases of confirmation bias and groupthink and all of this, that could quickly run through an organization to simply say, John, they don't pay us enough. And No one ever appreciates and values EMS. Don't ever talk about paramedics and EMTs as our nation's heroes. When's the last time you saw one of the bosses? And hey, John, the last time one of the soups talked to you, how would you characterize that conversation? It was negative, wasn't it? You got chewed out because you got 3 open PCRs. How all of this that we've gone to now, coupled with this kind of categorization of quiet quitting, could destroy our cultures really fast if we as leaders were cognitive of the concept and beginning to have a conversation about it.
So why do you think we have quiet quitting? Before we talk about what we might do about it, let's talk a little bit about why do we have it? What do you think's afoot here? Are we just now finding words for something that's always been there, or are we actually dealing with something new?
Well, what a great question. 3 thoughts come to mind. And of course, I'd love to hear your agreement. And more importantly, I'd love to hear your disagreement. Part of me wonders if it's always been out there, it's just the word we've finally given it. Part of me wonders that these past few years have stripped joy out of the world. And yet the joy hasn't come back. And the last thing I've been thinking about, and I mean this with deep respect to those listening and to the folks that we're honored to work with, part of it is, I think we deserve it. What do I mean by that? I don't think that we as EMS organizations have invested in leadership and management in a way that we should have always have done. And we've really been able to get by because previous generations valued the intrinsicness of EMS, the meaning that EMS brought, way over what the bosses might or might not be doing. And I think what I've been learning is our newest generations really value a positive experience, or really value the experience, whether it's positive or not. And when we've stripped so much of the experience away, when we call ambulances responses jobs, we call ambulances buses, we have names for a meeting that's about production. When I think we've stripped those things away, we've stripped the connection that they may have from leaders, such as our frontline leaders. When we've piled so much onto those supervisors, those frontline leaders, that we've taken so much away that we leave some employees in a position to feel like their only choice is to quit. The company's quit on me, whether that's real or perceived, and now I'm going to quit on them. So those are the 3 reflections that I've been thinking about. What do you think?
Well, I agree with you. I think, just to summarize what you said, I think that we both have not paid attention over the years because we haven't had to. We've had a stack of resumes on our desk, and so we haven't had to pay attention to this. So now we're having to pay attention to it. But I also think that coupled along with it, I think that the Gallup research shows that a significant number of people, there's been a significant increase in people that are finding less positive emotion and more negative emotion associated with their work. Many more people are reporting in the last 24 months feeling exhausted, without having their workload greater. Now, we know that if that's true, we also know that in many of our first responder organizations that actually the workload has gone up.
Yeah.
And that we are, especially because of short staffing, so that means fewer units to handle a higher volume. So all of these things are happening. But I thought a way to summarize that would be when we talked about this at the AAA conference last month. One of the ways we presented it is we said that we thought that right now the industry is confronting both a painful reckoning and an amazing opportunity. And the painful reckoning is really, I think many of our workers are saying, I love this job, but I also recognize that it's a challenging job for which I will pay an emotional, psychological toll for, that my family will, because I have to work after hours shifts, and we provide 24/7. It's a difficult role, and we haven't really acknowledged that. We've gotten by with fairly inexpensive labor, and we've gotten by in this part of first responder, unlike law enforcement and public safety, and fire service, we have not necessarily created an extrinsic rewards that are really commensurate with the work that's happening. So there's that going on. And along with this reckoning, though, is, of course, I think that we have not invested in leadership. We've not taught and prepared people to say, how do you create an environment where the work itself is difficult, but the environment to work is wonderful. So this is the reckoning. I think we're coming up, and I think that the piece about the reckoning that's really, really important is we're finally realizing or recognizing how important the relationship is. And I just want to say something about relationships. If engagement is about relationships are always dynamic. Relationships are always in the formation. And think about this: if you have a spouse or a partner or even a dear close friend, those relationships don't work without or thrive without investment. For those relationships to flourish and thrive, you have to put something into them. And so that is really where we get to the amazing opportunity. The amazing opportunity is that we get this chance to finally and really wake up to the fact that we are in the business of creating relationships with the people that we work with.
And one of the pieces of research that really emphasized a point about the relationship that you're just describing was from Harvard Business Review, when they were studying the Great Resignation of 2020-2021. And they asked folks that left their job with no plans of where they would go next, why? And as you can imagine, the people who responded to the survey listed many things, but one thing came out on top: they didn't feel listened to. They didn't talk about whether or not they had in-chair massages or whether or not the cafeteria had pizza on Thursday. They didn't even talk about compensation. They said they didn't feel listened to. Another quick data point, as they've been talking to people about this change from working remote to working in person, what they valued the most about working remote. And we can think of lots of things. This is this part about kind of the balance and quiet quitting. The thing that rose to the top, and number two wasn't even close, was they were able to get more sleep. I mean, imagine the world we're living in, where the richness of our life, we're judging by, can I get a few extra hours or a few extra minutes of sleep?
Yeah.
So, this piece about quiet quitting is here, what brought us here, but certainly that relationship piece is absolutely key.
And I just want to speak to leaders, because often leaders, we strut our accomplishments because we work in a business that provides an amazing and important service to the communities, right? We go out and take care of people in crisis, and so we think about that. I wanted to just read a quote here that Bob Chapman has, and he's the CEO of Barry Wehmiller which is a manufacturing company that is really, really interested in building this crazy, amazing, positive relationship with their employees. But he says this, he says, the greatest gift, the greatest charity we can give back to society is to be truly human leaders who treat the people under our leadership with profound respect and care, and not as objects for our success and wealth. In other words, we need to see ourselves as stewards of the lives we've been given an opportunity to lead and influence. Now, why I'm reading that is I think that, then this is my encouragement, Aarron, to all of the chiefs and leaders of first responder organizations I'm working with, which is to say, stop thinking that your most important job is to take good care of the patients and the people out in the street. As leaders, your most important job is to start taking care of people. And so in that spirit, I just came up with 5 questions I think that we need to be asking.
And not surprising, let me throw one thing in front of that. So
Right.
As we think about what are the meaningful, measurable, actionable things we can do around quiet quitting and building and strengthening relationships, especially with our employees. And I think your 5 questions, without even knowing what they are likely going to mirror this. We have to start being more curious.
So you're right on it. So the first question mirrors what you said earlier, which is the first question here on my list is, are you genuinely listening to your people? You don't have to have an answer. You don't have to have lots of fixes, but if you can give the gift of genuinely listening, and behind that genuine listening is the word that Aarron just talked about, which is curiosity. If you can be really curious, why aren't they happy? Why, when we just gave them a raise last month, or when we gave them new PTO benefits 6 months ago, why are they still struggling? Get curious. And one of the things that happens when you get really curious about the other is you stop worrying about yourself and taking it personally. And that's how you can listen. So that's the first question. Are you genuinely listening to your people? The second one is, do you genuinely care about your people's subjective well-being? Now, subjective well-being is a fancy way of talking about their experience. Are you genuinely caring or concerned about their experience? What are they experiencing? Get curious about that. And the third question is, I think, one that really gets to our structure, and it's really one that we can do something about. Is everyone in your organization connected to someone whose job is to care about them? This is really important in services where we're dynamically deployed and we have people picking up trucks and leaving. Is there someone in the organization that those frontline employees are connected with who really cares about them? You and I, Aarron, see this over and over again, that what happens is frontline employees get kind of lost. So the last 2 questions is our culture promoting poor self-care? Are we rewarding the kind of burnout, the kind of overworking, the kind of exhaustion that is so typical of the toxic martyrdom of first responder agencies? So are we creating that? Is that what we're really rewarding? And if so, don't be surprised if you have quiet quitting. And the last one is, are we adequately preparing our people to deal with adversity? So if things are more challenging today, are we pausing enough to sit down and say, how do we teach people how to really rock and roll with adversity? How do we teach them to get good at coming to work and having to be told that you are going to go on a 4-hour transfer, or you are going to have to go move to a different station, or you are going to have to double up and do something that you weren't planning on doing? How do we adequately prepare people for that? And that gets really to this whole area, and we of course won't talk about it today, but it's this whole area of how do we foster amazing mental fitness amongst our people?
And my encouragement for all that are listening is before I begin those 5 questions, make sure you are a practitioner of listening and a master of conversations. And I say that because many of the executives that might be listening, often your role is to speak, is to give answers, is to share the direction. And so when you're approached with a problem, with a thought, with an idea, the brain likely immediately shifts into gear and says, how do I solve this? John's 5 questions aren't about any solutions. One of the strongest things, and I'll mess up Paul Tillich's quote, so I'll leave it for John because he will say it correctly and say it well. But one of the most powerful things we can do in strengthening a relationship is just to listen.
Yeah.
And we teach in our academy that there's 4 levels of listening. Often we practice the first 2 a little bit too much. We don't listen, or we pretend like we're listening. And then too often, conversations in the world we live in today are 2 people speaking, often over each other, often at the same time. And if they're not doing that, 2 people speaking, but really each waiting for the other to stop, simply so that they can say what they want to say. And John, you characterize it so well and so succinctly, which is a conversation is an openness or a willingness to hear something new or different. Doesn't mean John's going to convince me. We may be having a debate about one of the most difficult topics of our time. But if I'm truly using these things, both a listening and conversational style of leadership, I will hear John say something that hopefully I'll even acknowledge, saying, that's a good point, John. I hadn't thought of that. I'm not sure it changes my mind, but that's a perspective I didn't have. So if we're going to do those 5 questions, and I hope we do, let's open our mind through curiosity. Let's get these things ready to go through true listening, and let's be ready for good conversation, so that those 5 questions can be really maximized in our practice of leadership.
I really like that you mentioned mastering conversation. If you are curious as a leader about whether you're a good conversationalist, ask some people that know you really well. Mm-hmm. Ask someone that loves and lives with you if you're a good conversationalist, or even better, if you're really daring, just ask the question that says, if I were to be better at conversation, what do I need to improve on? Mm. And just get that feedback. That's when Brené Brown talks about vulnerability as being courageous. That's what she's talking about. She's talking about the sort of vulnerability that says that I'm willing to admit that I may not be where I am. I would say, Aarron, and maybe you'll challenge my numbers, but I would say that we probably only meet about 5% of the executives that we work with have really made it their business to become good conversationalists and listeners. Let me say that again, only about 5%. That means 95% are not in that camp.
Yeah. And I think that number is gracious, and I mean that with respect. But it often shows up when folks reach out to you or I, or to both of us, and want us to talk to them about how we might help them strengthen engagement and culture. And then they spend 95% of the time talking during that session where they're hoping we will help them by explaining to them about culture and engagement.
Yes. Well, in summary, we've talked about quiet quitting, and we've talked about it in kind of two areas. One is employees finding more balance, and the other area is employees actually disengaging and no longer concerned about furthering the organization and doing more than what's absolutely and essentially required. We've talked about ways of paying attention to that is simply to begin to notice what's going on in your organization and actually care about it and recognize how important this is for success in your organization. And we mentioned a few questions around listening and around really caring and really around the culture of your organization. So this is our simple way of helping you recognize that this reckoning, this painful reckoning that we're all in now, can be turned into an amazing opportunity.
And my encouragement is, here the solutions or some of the tactics that we've suggested. We didn't suggest that you needed a master's degree or a doctoral dissertation. We suggested things like listening, conversation, being curious, and asking some questions. Skills and talents we already have. What we're hoping is that you'll choose to preference those things. As you notice, John and I are trying in our own practice of leadership to sharpen it every month. A new topic, a new book, a new concept. Similar in my 30-some years, John's 40-some years in EMS, as we practiced as paramedics, we learned about a new ultrasound scan or a new theory about acid base, and the list goes on. I'm just curious to know if we as leaders are investing as much in that growing and developing the new concepts of leadership as we do invest in the new concept of operation, finance, and clinical. More balance. It's always so good to talk to you, John.
You too, Aarron. I hope our listeners appreciate it, and just let them know that we are always welcome to hear feedback, and please feel free to reach out to us, and we'll look forward to the next time we're together.
Great. Thanks, John.